Alrighty, Jeanne Woodbury, thank you so much for joining me today. You're currently a member of the progressive lobbying firm Creosote, but you've also done nonprofit work, advocacy work. You were a former math teacher, a lot of former roles there. I'm sure you've heard your title described as that many times, a progressive lobbying firm, member of a progressive lobbying firm. But what does that actually look like day to day? Like, what does that even mean, I guess?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's that much different from any other government affairs firm. The great thing for me about this job is we represent groups that we're values aligned with and that we feel are doing important work. So we're showing up to work and we get to work with people we think are fantastic, and we get to work on issues that we personally care about. So I love that because I'm not showing up and saying, okay, let me convince myself to think that, we really need to pass this bill for Coca-Cola or whatever that, I could see one way or another. I get to show up and say, hey, this matters to me personally and to people I know.
Yeah, absolutely. You actually believe in what you're fighting for.
Yeah.
And I know you've been very busy this year lobbying at the state capitol. I've seen you several times get up there and talk to lawmakers. Um, Considering the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric that certainly didn't appear with the second Trump presidency, but seems to have gotten louder, what is it like being in such an active part of the political world right now, not only as a transgender person, but somebody who advocates for transgender rights?
Well, I've been politically active since I was a teenager. And at the time, I was a Republican. I was active in conservative politics. So, really, in my life, I've always been around relatively extreme anti-LGBT rhetoric, including from people I thought were pretty great people. So, I'm acculturated to it to a certain degree, but that doesn't make it okay, and that doesn't make it easy to handle. But the reality is, when I go to the Capitol to work, the rhetoric is secondary. I'm there to make sure that good policy gets passed and bad policy doesn't.
Right. And I know a lot of the times, the the anti-LGBTQ bills that we see come from Republicans. I know you talked to them a lot at the state capitol. As you just said, you were a Republican up until 2016. What was like, can you take me back to that moment or the slow burn that pushed you to walk away from the party?
It wasn't so much walking away from the party as it was a reexamination of my own political values. I think that a lot of the things I believe in broad strokes haven't really changed. But then the question of how that should actually apply to policy has changed quite a bit for me in terms of how I answer that. So I think one of the things that it's extremely fun for me when I'm hanging out with my progressive friends is to say kind of the most conservative thing I can say that I actually agree with, just to scandalize them a little bit. But fundamentally, I think that politics isn't so much about belief, although obviously that's important. It's about how to make sure that policy works for people.
Yeah. So you said you were pretty involved in the party politics back then.
I hate party politics. So I was in nonprofit work then, just like I
Okay.
am now. I don't really love the internal party politics.
Gotcha. So, you just mentioned like bringing up these things in your friend group to be scandalous, but are there any typical Republican beliefs you still hold, like ideals?
Well, what's interesting is I find that I agree with Alex Collison on a lot of issues. But I don't know if those are necessarily typical Republican issues. But there's a number of things that are more on like the libertarian side of civil liberties that I think a number of my clients really agree with, and I personally agree with. I don't know if those are really partisan issues.
Okay, fair enough. Um, on the opposite side of the spectrum there, are there any sort of blind spots you think Democrats have right now, especially in Arizona?
Yes. Democrats, for all of the wonderful people that I get to work with in the Democratic caucus at the legislature, they have a number of blind spots. I think one of the biggest ones, and it's understandable, is any bill that has to do with anything remotely sexual. They're very hesitant in terms of how they vote. So even when they understand in principle why a bill is a bad bill, they're afraid of casting a vote that looks a certain way in terms of how they imagine voters are paying attention to the work they're doing. And, I always like to say that, as much as it would be great for voters to pay attention to every bill, they don't have time to do that. And what they really want is people to vote for good policy. And so if you're looking at a bill that seems like, okay, well, I don't want to vote for this because of the title, or I want to vote for this because of the title, but I know that I should vote the other way because of the content, just vote the way that you should vote based on the content of the bill. And, there's ways to deal with the fallout from a particularly incendiary title, but that's a big blind spot I notice.
Yeah, and I think that's specifically applied to the porn age restriction bill that Katie Hobbs just passed. And I wrote a story about this, I think last week or the week before, but there's a lot of concerns in the community about restricting access to a lot of things besides, graphic material. Is that something you had conversations with lawmakers about or what?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was able to work quite a bit on HB 2112. That's the bill we're talking about, which initially was kind of billed as a age verification for pornography online. The bill that was signed doesn't say anything about pornography, although they never took that out of the short title. But actually, that was a really positive experience in terms of working with legislators, despite the final outcome. This is a bill that wasn't fully understood when it first went through the House, and it got a lot of bipartisan support. When it went into the Senate, we were able to work really closely with some great legislative champions there to turn that vote around. When it went back to the House after receiving some technical amendments, again, we saw a big shift in the vote count. And that was because of a lot of legislators being willing to listen and reevaluate their understanding of a bill, which is not easy. And I really appreciated that. So that was a positive process, honestly, despite the outcome.
Yeah. And I think, 90 days whenever the lawmakers do adjourn, that will go into effect, that age verification bill. You have to prove you're above 18 to watch porn online, basically. Um, I mean, are there any like sort of preventative measures to keep that bill from restricting things that aren't, you know,
Well, essentially, the same law is before the Supreme Court right now.
yeah.
So this is something that really shouldn't have been moved at all this session because we're waiting to see what the court even says about the legality of it. When it goes into effect, it's not even accurate to say that you'll have to verify your age to view pornography online because pornography is on a lot of websites like Reddit or X, where that adult content doesn't make up the proportion of the website's content necessary to meet the threshold for this bill.
Oh.
So you can still just go onto those websites and see all the pornography you want without verifying your age. This is going to apply to certain websites, and the definition is very vague. So what we've seen is that this is probably going to be interpreted in ways that censor content that doesn't have anything to do with pornography. Especially because this bill that was in the form it was signed is built around a private right of action. So you can imagine any number of like Moms for Liberty groups deciding I'm going to sue Planned Parenthood or Sex FYI because I think this is material harmful to minors. And even if that case doesn't work out for them, it's not like everyone can afford to be in court all the time. So I think what we'll see is that pornography will continue to be easily accessible for minors online unless parents are proactively working with their kids to make the internet a safe place. But on the other hand, important sex education content and LGBT content will be sort of censored by proxy because of the risk of expensive lawsuits.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's like a third of the content on a website has to be considered, sexually explicit. I don't know the exact wording of the bill for it to be blocked under this bill. And for those of us who grew up with the internet our whole lives, we know social media feeds are just full of that kind of stuff, and it's not, you know, um, really a full-on ban at all. Okay. I am going to ask you five sort of non-political, just fun questions if you're up for it.
Yeah, totally.
Alrighty. Okay, so you told me you also make websites and you little mini campaigns sometimes in your free time. What's your favorite side project you've done for fun or activism or whatever?
One of the most fun projects I've done recently was a No on Prop 138 campaign. So this was the tipped minimum wage exception where it was saying instead of this flat exception that we've had of $3 less than minimum wage, we're going to change it to 25%. Well, immediately 25% of minimum wage is more than $3, and minimum wage goes up every year. The 25% goes up every year, and it's just more and more and more every year. And so this was being billed on a lot of street signs as, protect tipped workers. And my thought was just protect them from what? Getting paid? Like all this is a pay cut. And the math is really simple. And so I felt like there should be signs that say, no on Prop 138, we can do the fucking math. Like, stop pretending that this isn't obvious. And so I just made the signs, we can do the fucking math. I was thrilled to learn a little bit about political sign law and the fact that people weren't allowed to take those down despite the swear word. And it was a blast. It got some positive attention. Ultimately, Prop 138 went down in flames, like 74% against. That had nothing to do with my work, but it was still a lot of fun. I got to debate Steve Shukri on TV, basically by virtue of making these signs. So that was a blast. And I made a website for it, which is thebottomline.fyi. And it just walks through the math of how this tipped work exception fucks tipped workers over.
That is so funny. Did people try to take down those signs?
Oh, most of them were taken down, which was a
Really?
crime, but there's no way to actually, track those. So, I
Yeah.
mean, there is, but I didn't want to spend the money on
Accurate.
tracking
Yeah.
it. It wasn't important to me.
That's so funny. Okay, what is the most unexpectedly useful skill you've picked up during your political career? That has nothing to do with politics, really.
Oh my God. Not to keep talking about websites, but honestly, being able to write JavaScript has been one of the most useful things. I got my foot in the door at a nonprofit by being able to help them with some JavaScript for their website, which was like the first time I had ever written JavaScript, but that's how nonprofits work. And ever since then, I've gotten to learn more and more and build useful tools that help my work. It's a lot of behind the scenes stuff, but I made this website called altledge.net, which is another tool that just helps me get things done a little bit faster. So nothing to do with politics, but it does make my work easier.
Yeah, I'm sure that is really helpful. Is there something about Arizona politics specifically that outsiders never understand, or one of your friends who's not involved politically says, and you're like, that's not quite right.
Well, I mean, the biggest one is everyone thinks it ends at 100 days.
Yeah.
So anytime I'm working with someone outside of Arizona, they think, oh, we hit the 100-day mark. They must be done or they must be wrapping up soon. And I just have to explain to them, like, no, it's going to go until Christmas. Like, they can do whatever they want. And that they can do whatever they want is the biggest thing that I think people don't really grasp intuitively. When we talk about any kind of legislative procedure, anything about how a bill can get killed, ultimately the rules are what they make them. And people don't really understand how freeform everything is here. But I think mostly legislative politics is inscrutable to most people, regardless of state.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a hill you'd die on that has nothing to do with politics? Like you had to go up to the a committee hearing and argue like the hot dog is a sandwich or something stupid like that.
Oh, I mean, a hot dog is a sandwich. I don't think I would die on that hill, but I just called them sandwiches the other day to one of my coworkers without even thinking about it. So I think they are just intuitively sandwiches. I think if I had to die on a hill, it would probably just be that we need to assign more books in classes. Um, I don't think people are reading enough in school.
Yeah, I think we're heading the opposite direction right now, but I agree. Okay, and last question for you. If you weren't in the lobbying field right now, a non-political role, what job would you be doing? What's your dream job that doesn't have to do with politics?
My dream job that has nothing to do with politics, my whole life has always been to work in a library. I have worked in a library before. Ultimately, I prefer working in politics, but I adore libraries. So if I got kicked out of politics forever, I'd go and try to work in a library.
Oh, I love that. That's a great answer. All right. Well, that's all I had for you, Jeanne. I really appreciate your time.